There are people who walk through life with their hands open, their hearts exposed, and their spirits tuned to frequencies most never hear. They feel the sadness in a stranger's smile. They hear the loneliness beneath laughter. They carry the weight of rooms they enter, and they leave carrying pieces of everyone they've met. And for years, maybe their entire lives, they believed this was their gift, their purpose, to soothe, to heal, to give endlessly, to be the safe harbor for every storm that wasn't even theirs. But something shifts, quietly at first, like a whisper beneath the noise. A small voice inside that begins to ask a question they've been too afraid to speak aloud. What if all this giving has been slowly erasing me? There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from being too much for too many. It's the tiredness that sleep doesn't fix, the heaviness that rest doesn't lift. It's the weariness of a soul that has spent years bending, shape-shifting, softening its edges so that others might feel comfortable in its presence. The empath learns early. They learn that their sensitivity is both magic and burden, that their ability to feel what others feel makes them valuable, but only if they use it in service of everyone else. So they become experts at reading rooms, masters of intuition, artists of adaptation. They learn to shrink when someone needs to feel big, to silence themselves when someone else needs to speak, to pour from a cup that nobody thought to refill. And they do this not out of weakness, but out of a profound, almost painful love for the world. Because they genuinely believe that if they can just give enough, care enough, understand enough, then maybe finally they'll be enough. But here's the paradox that lives at the center of the empath's existence. The very thing that makes them so capable of connection is the same thing that disconnects them from themselves. They become so fluent in the language of others that they forget their own voice, so attuned to the needs around them that their own needs become background noise, so skilled at holding space that they forget they too deserve to take up space. And the people around them? They rarely notice. Not because they're cruel, but because the empath has become so convincing in their role. They've perfected the performance of being fine, of being available, of being the one who never asks for too much because they're too busy giving it all away. It's a strange kind of invisibility, to be seen and yet unseen, to be needed and yet not truly known, to be loved for what you provide, but not for who you are beneath the providing. I once knew someone who described it like living behind glass. Everyone could see her. Everyone could reach her when they needed something. But no one ever thought to ask if she could breathe in there, if the glass was thick enough to muffle her screams, if she'd been trying to get out for years, but every time she pressed against the surface, someone on the other side mistook it for a wave hello. This is what people-pleasing does to the empath. It doesn't just drain them, it erases them, layer by layer, choice by choice, yes by yes, until one day they look in the mirror and barely recognize the person staring back. Because that person has become a composite of everyone's expectations, a mosaic of other people's needs, a reflection that reflects everyone but themselves. And here's what makes it so insidious. The empath believes they're doing the right thing. They believe their exhaustion is noble. Their self-abandonment is sacrifice. Their silence is love. Because somewhere along the way, they internalized a lie that many sensitive souls carry like a scar. That their worth is measured by how much they can endure without complaint, how much they can give without asking for return, how much they can love without being loved back in equal measure. But there comes a moment. For some it's sudden, a collapse, a breakdown, a moment when the body simply refuses to carry on. For others it's gradual, a slow awakening, a quiet realization that blooms like dawn after a long night. But it comes. And when it does, everything changes. It's the moment when the empath stops, just stops, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in a deep, bone-level recognition that something fundamental must shift or they will disappear entirely. And this is where the real journey begins. Because when the empath stops people-pleasing, they don't just change a behavior. They dismantle an entire identity. They begin to question everything they thought they knew about love, about kindness, about what it means to be good. And they start to see truths that have been hidden in plain sight, truths that are uncomfortable, unsettling, and ultimately liberating. The first truth is this: not everyone who accepts your care actually cares about you. Some people are drawn to empaths not because they value them, but because they consume them. They sense the giver's nature the way a predator senses vulnerability. And they take, and call it connection. They call it friendship. They call it love. But it's extraction. It's transaction. It's a relationship built on the unspoken agreement that you will continue to give and they will continue to receive. And the moment you stop, the illusion collapses. When the empath begins to see this, it's devastating. Because they've invested so much. Not just time or energy, but heart. They've believed in these people. They've made excuses for them. They've told themselves stories to justify the imbalance. Maybe they're going through something. Maybe they don't realize. Maybe if I just love them harder, they'll finally see me. But the truth is simpler and more painful. Some people never intended to see you. They only intended to use the light you give off to navigate their own darkness. And the moment you stop being their torch, they'll find another. The second truth is equally difficult. Your empathy has been weaponized, sometimes by others but often by yourself. Because empathy, when unbalanced, becomes a tool of self-harm. It becomes the reason you stay in situations that hurt you, the excuse you use to tolerate disrespect, the lens through which you rationalize your own mistreatment. You tell yourself, they didn't mean it, they're struggling, they're wounded, they need patience, and all of that may be true. But it's also true that understanding someone's pain does not obligate you to become its target. Compassion does not require you to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. When the empath stops people-pleasing, they start to distinguish between compassion and compliance, between kindness and self-betrayal, between loving someone and losing themselves in the process. And they realize that real empathy includes empathy for oneself, that real care includes self-care. That real love never demands you become smaller so that someone else can stay comfortable in their dysfunction. The third truth is perhaps the most liberating and the most lonely. When you stop people-pleasing, you lose people. Not everyone, but some, and sometimes many. Because the version of you that bent and gave and never asked for much, that version was convenient. It was easy to love because it never challenged anyone to grow. It never set boundaries. It never said no. It never asked the people around it to show up with the same energy it offered so freely. And when you change, when you start honoring your own needs and speaking your own truth and requiring reciprocity, some people won't like it. They'll call you selfish, cold, changed. They'll mourn the version of you that didn't push back. They'll tell you you've lost your kindness, when really, you've just stopped giving it away to people who never valued it in the first place. This is the loneliness of awakening, the isolation that comes when you outgrow the role you were cast in, when you refuse to keep playing small in a script you never wrote. It's painful, it's disorienting, and for a while, it feels like you've made a terrible mistake. But you haven't. Because on the other side of that loss is something the empath has been searching for their entire life without knowing it: space, breath, self. The wild, exhilarating, terrifying freedom of living as yourself, not as everyone's therapist, not as everyone's emotional support system, not as the person who fixes and soothes and absorbs, but as a whole, complex, imperfect human being who has needs and limits and a voice that deserves to be heard. And here's what begins to happen when the empath stops people-pleasing and starts seeing the truth. They discover that they're not less loving, they're more discerning. Their empathy doesn't disappear, it matures. It becomes wiser, more intentional. They learn to direct their energy toward people and situations that honor it. They learn that saying no to what depletes them creates space for what nourishes them. They learn that boundaries aren't walls. They're bridges to healthier, more authentic relationships. They also discover something unexpected. The people who truly matter, the ones who love them beyond utility, beyond convenience, those people don't leave. In fact, those relationships deepen, because for the first time they're built on truth rather than performance, on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving, on two people showing up fully rather than one person disappearing so the other can shine. And slowly, gradually, the empath begins to trust something they've never fully trusted before, that they are enough without the giving, that they are worthy without the sacrifice, that they can be loved not for what they do, but for who they are. This doesn't mean they become hard. It doesn't mean they lose their sensitivity or their gift for feeling deeply. It means they learn to protect it, to steward it, to offer it wisely rather than indiscriminately. They learn that their empathy is precious, not cheap, that their presence is valuable, not obligatory, that their heart is a treasure, not a resource to be mined until nothing remains. There's a teaching from the contemplative tradition that speaks to this transformation. Thomas Merton once wrote about the difference between the false self and the true self. The false self, he said, is the self we construct to please others, to fit in, to be accepted. It's the mask we wear, the role we play, the person we pretend to be because we believe our real self isn't enough. The true self, by contrast, is who we are beneath all the performance. It's the self that exists before we learn to shape ourselves to other people's expectations. It's wild and honest and sometimes uncomfortable. It doesn't always say the right thing or smile at the right moment. But it's real. And Merton believed that the spiritual journey is, fundamentally, a journey from the false self to the true self, from the mask to the face beneath it. When the empath stops people-pleasing, they're engaging in this sacred work. They're removing the mask. They're shedding the false self they built to survive and revealing the true self they were always meant to be. And this, more than anything, is what threatens the people who benefited from their self-abandonment. Because the false self is controllable. The true self is not. But here's what the empath eventually comes to understand. Living as your true self, even with all its discomfort and uncertainty, is infinitely more fulfilling than living as a beloved lie. Because you can be adored by thousands for a version of yourself that doesn't exist and still feel utterly alone. But to be truly seen and truly loved by even a handful of people who know the real you, that's the connection the empath has been starving for all along. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's not a single decision, but 1,000 small ones. Every time the empath chooses honesty over harmony, every time they choose presence over performance, every time they honor their own needs without apologizing for having them, they're building a new way of being, a new relationship with themselves and with the world. And yes, there are moments of doubt. Moments when the old patterns call them back, when it feels easier to just give in, to return to the familiar role, to stop rocking the boat. Because change is uncomfortable, and growth is lonely. And sometimes the empath wonders if they're being too much, asking too much, expecting too much. But then they remember the exhaustion, the erasure, the years spent living as a shadow of themselves, and they realize that they're not asking for too much. They're asking for what everyone deserves, to be seen, to be valued, to exist in their fullness without having to dim their light or shrink their soul or apologize for taking up space. And this is the paradox that resolves at the heart of the empath's journey. The thing they were most afraid of, that if they stopped giving so much they would lose love, turns out to be inverted. Because what they actually lose is the illusion of love. The false connections built on transaction rather than truth. And what they gain is the possibility of real love, the kind that doesn't require them to disappear, the kind that celebrates them as they are, not as someone wishes they would be. Think about how many years the empath spent believing that love was earned through service, through availability, through the willingness to bend until breaking. They watched others receive love seemingly without effort, without the constant vigilance, without the exhausting dance of anticipating needs before they were spoken, and they wondered what made them different, what made their love conditional on perpetual giving while others seemed to be loved simply for existing. The answer, they eventually discover, isn't that they're less deserving. It's that they were taught a distorted definition of love. Somewhere in their history, perhaps in childhood, perhaps through early relationships, perhaps through a world that praises selflessness without acknowledging its cost, they learned that love is something you purchase with pieces of yourself. That affection is the currency you receive when you trade in your boundaries. That connection is what remains after you've given everything away. But this was never true. It was never love they were receiving in those transactions. It was approval, perhaps, appreciation maybe, the comfort of others, certainly. But love, Real love, the kind that nourishes rather than depletes, doesn't ask you to disappear to prove your worth. It doesn't require constant sacrifice to remain valid. It doesn't demand that you set aside your humanity so others can maintain theirs. The empath realizes something profound in this awakening. They realize that they've spent years teaching people how to treat them poorly. Not intentionally, not consciously, but through every boundary they didn't set, every need they didn't voice, every moment they swallowed their truth to keep the peace. They showed the world that their comfort was negotiable, their time was unlimited, their energy was renewable, and the world, as it often does, believed them. Now comes the uncomfortable work of unteaching those lessons, of showing up differently, of saying the things they've left unsaid for years. And this is where the journey becomes truly difficult, because changing the dynamic doesn't just affect how others see them. It forces the empath to confront how they see themselves. For so long, they've built their identity around being the person others could lean on, the reliable one, the understanding one, the one who always has room for one more burden, one more crisis, one more person who needs saving. When they step away from that role, they have to ask themselves a terrifying question. Who am I when I'm not being what everyone needs me to be? This identity crisis is inevitable, and it's necessary, because the self the empath has been performing isn't their true self. It's a survival mechanism, a coping strategy, a way of ensuring love by making themselves indispensable. But indispensable isn't the same as valued. Needed isn't the same as wanted. Useful isn't the same as loved. The empath has to grieve who they thought they were. They have to mourn the relationships that can't survive their evolution. They have to sit with the discomfort of not knowing who they'll become when they stop contorting themselves into shapes that fit other people's needs. This grief is real. It's valid, and it's part of the process. But beneath that grief, something else is waiting. Something the empath hasn't felt in years, maybe ever. It's the quiet thrill of authenticity, the strange lightness that comes from living without pretense, the unfamiliar sensation of having energy left at the end of the day, because they haven't spent it all managing everyone else's emotional weather. They start to notice small things, that they can have opinions without immediately softening them to make others comfortable, that they can share their struggles without immediately pivoting to make sure everyone else is okay first, that they can take up space, real space, not just the corners and edges they've been living in, without the world collapsing around them. And slowly, carefully, they begin to rebuild their life with different materials. Instead of obligation, they use intention. Instead of guilt, they use clarity. Instead of fear of rejection, they use trust in their own worth. The foundation is different now, more solid, built on bedrock instead of quicksand. There's a moment in this journey that feels like waking up, like emerging from underwater, like the first breath after holding it too long. It's the moment when the empath realizes they've been living in a world that taught them to betray themselves and called it virtue. That trained them to ignore their own pain and called it strength. That convinced them their needs were burdens and their boundaries were cruelty. And they see finally that the problem was never their sensitivity. The problem was a world that wanted to benefit from their gifts without honoring their humanity. That wanted their light without acknowledging the darkness they navigated to keep it burning. But the empath doesn't have to live by those rules anymore. They can write new ones. They can build a life where their empathy is a choice, not a compulsion. Where their compassion includes themselves. Where their love is an offering, not a depletion. They can surround themselves with people who understand that reciprocity isn't transactional, it's foundational. That healthy relationships are built on mutual care, mutual respect, mutual presence. And in this new way of being, something unexpected emerges. The empath discovers that they're not just surviving anymore, they're thriving. That they have energy they didn't know existed, because they're no longer pouring it into bottomless cups. That they have joy they'd forgotten, because they're finally present for their own life, instead of living vicariously through everyone else's. They also discover that their empathy, when properly bounded and wisely directed, becomes even more powerful. Because it's no longer scattered and reactive. It's focused and intentional. They can still feel deeply. They can still offer care and support and understanding, but now they do it from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, from strength rather than desperation, from choice rather than obligation. And the people who receive their empathy now, the ones who've earned it through their own presence and reciprocity, they feel the difference. Because they're not receiving scraps, they're receiving the genuine article. The full-hearted, clear-minded, boundaried empathy of someone who knows their worth and has chosen to share their gift freely, not because they have to, but because they want to. This is what happens when the empath stops people-pleasing and starts seeing the truth. They don't become less, they become more. More themselves, more alive, more free. They don't lose their capacity for love. They refine it. They elevate it. They make it sacred again by refusing to cast it before those who would trample it. There's a particular moment in this transformation that feels like standing at the edge of something vast. It's when the empath realizes they've been living their entire life as if asking permission to exist. Permission to have needs, permission to feel tired, permission to say no, permission to prioritize themselves without it being an emergency or a breakdown. And they see how exhausting that is. How diminishing. To live every day seeking approval for the most basic acts of self-care, to feel guilty for resting, to apologize for having limits, to treat their own humanity as an inconvenience that must be justified, explained, made palatable to those around them. The empath begins to understand that they don't need permission, not from their family, not from their friends, not from partners or colleagues or anyone else. They need only their own recognition that they are as worthy of care as anyone they've ever cared for, that their needs are as legitimate as anyone else's they've ever prioritized, that their boundaries are as valid as any boundary they've ever respected in others. This realization doesn't come all at once. It comes in waves, in moments, in small acts of defiance against old patterns. The first time they say no without a lengthy explanation. The first time they cancel plans because they need rest, not because they're sick. The first time they speak their truth even when it creates tension. Each of these moments is a declaration. Each is a small revolution. And with each one, the empath feels something shift. The world doesn't end. People don't abandon them en masse. The sky doesn't fall. Instead, something quieter happens. Something more profound. They begin to respect themselves. And in that self-respect, they start to see who's been with them all along, truly with them, and who was only there for what they could extract. The people who stay, who adjust, who respect the new boundaries, these are the relationships worth keeping. These are the people who love the empath beneath the giving, not just the giving itself. And these relationships don't weaken when the empath stops over-functioning. They strengthen, they deepen, they become more honest, more balanced, more real. But the empath also has to face something difficult. Some people won't adjust. Some relationships won't survive. And not because those people are evil or malicious, but because the relationship was built on an imbalanced foundation. It was structured around one person giving and another taking, and when that structure shifts, when reciprocity is required, some people simply can't or won't meet the new standard. This is painful. Even when the empath knows intellectually that these relationships weren't healthy, there's still grief, still loss, because they invested hope there. They saw potential. They believed that if they just loved hard enough, gave enough, understood enough, the other person would eventually see them, would eventually reciprocate, would eventually value what they brought beyond its utility. But some people never will, and the empath has to make peace with that. Has to release the fantasy of who these people could become and accept the reality of who they are. Has to stop setting themselves on fire to keep others warm. Has to recognize that walking away from what depletes you isn't cruelty. It's self-preservation. It's survival. It's sanity. And perhaps most importantly, they become a living example of what's possible when you choose yourself without apology. When you honor your needs without shame. When you recognize that self-preservation isn't selfish, it's necessary. That boundaries aren't barriers, they're bridges. That saying no to what depletes you creates space for what restores you. The journey isn't easy. There are losses. There is grief. There are moments when you question everything and everyone, including yourself. But on the other side of that uncertainty is a life that actually feels like yours. A life where you're not performing or pleasing or pretending. A life where you can breathe, where you can rest, where you can exist without constantly monitoring everyone else's comfort at the expense of your own. There's a peculiar silence that comes with this transformation. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of peace. The empath discovers what it feels like to sit in a room without automatically scanning for tension, to have a conversation without tracking every micro-expression to gauge if they're saying the right thing, to exist without the constant background hum of other people's emotional states running through their nervous system like electrical current. At first, this silence is unsettling. The empath has been so accustomed to the noise, the emotional noise, the mental noise, the endless internal dialogue of anticipating and accommodating. That quiet feels strange, almost suspicious. They catch themselves waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for someone to need something, waiting for the crisis that will pull them back into the old pattern. But slowly they learn to trust the quiet. They learn that peace isn't the absence of care, it's the presence of balance. That stillness isn't indifference, it's rest. That they can be deeply connected to the people they love without being consumed by them. That empathy doesn't require enmeshment. That compassion doesn't demand codependence. This is when the empath begins to understand the difference between feeling with someone and feeling for someone. Feeling with requires presence, attention, genuine care. Feeling for, on the other hand, is taking on someone else's emotional experience as if it were your own. It's carrying their pain as if you're responsible for it. It's suffering because they're suffering, not out of solidarity, but out of an inability to maintain healthy separation between where you end and they begin. The awakened empath learns to feel with. They can witness someone's pain without absorbing it. They can offer support without taking ownership of someone else's healing. They can hold space without filling it with their own anxiety about fixing, solving, or making everything better. They learn that sometimes the most loving thing they can do is simply be present, not as a rescuer, not as a savior, not as someone who will shoulder the burden, but as a witness to another person's experience. This shift changes everything. Because when the empath stops trying to fix everyone, people stop treating them like a tool for their own emotional regulation. When they stop absorbing everyone's pain, people stop dumping their unprocessed emotions at their feet. When they maintain boundaries, the people who truly care about them learn to respect those boundaries, and the people who don't, well, they reveal themselves. And here's something else the empath discovers. When they stop people-pleasing, they actually become more effective at helping the people who genuinely matter to them. Because their energy isn't scattered across 100 different needs, it's focused, intentional. They can show up fully for the relationships that are reciprocal, because they're not exhausted from pouring into relationships that are extractive. They also become more honest, more real, more trustworthy, paradoxically, because people know they're getting the truth, not a carefully crafted response designed to keep the peace. When the empath says yes, people know it's a real yes. When they say they're fine, it's actually true. When they offer support, it comes from genuine desire, not obligation. But perhaps the most profound shift happens in how the empath relates to their own inner landscape. For years, they've treated their own emotions like inconveniences, things to be managed, suppressed, or dealt with quickly, so they could get back to being available for everyone else. Their own sadness was something to hide. Their own anger was something to bury. Their own needs were something to minimize. Now, they begin to honor their own emotional experience with the same reverence they've always offered to others. They allow themselves to feel without judgment, to be sad without fixing it, to be angry without apologizing for it, to need something without making themselves smaller for having the need. They discover that their emotions aren't weaknesses or flaws, they're information. They're messengers carrying important data about their internal state, their boundaries, their values, their well-being. And when they actually listen to these messengers instead of silencing them, they make better decisions. They create healthier relationships. They build a life that actually aligns with who they are instead of who everyone else needs them to be. There's a moment in this process that feels like coming home. It's subtle. It might happen while they're alone, in silence, doing something simple, making tea, watching the sunset, sitting in their own space, and they realize they're not anxious about who they're disappointing. They're not rehearsing conversations in their head, trying to figure out how to say what they need to say without upsetting anyone. They're not carrying the weight of everyone's expectations. They're just there, present, in their own life, in their own body, in their own moment. And it feels like the first full breath they've taken in years. This is freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever they want without consequence. That's not maturity. But the freedom to be who they actually are without apologizing for it. The freedom to make choices based on their own values rather than other people's reactions. The freedom to say no without guilt and yes without resentment. The freedom to exist as a whole person with needs, limits, desires, and boundaries, just like everyone else. The empath realizes they've spent so much time trying to earn their place in other people's lives that they forgot they're allowed to simply occupy space. That existence itself is enough, that they don't have to justify their worth through endless giving, that being loved shouldn't require constant auditions. And as this realization deepens, something else emerges. Anger. Not the explosive, destructive kind, but the clarifying kind. The kind that comes when you finally see how much you've tolerated in the name of love. How many times you've bitten your tongue. How many moments you've swallowed your truth. How many relationships you've sustained through your effort alone, while the other person coasted on your momentum. This anger is healthy. It's appropriate. It's the natural response to recognizing that you've been treated as less than you deserve. And the empath learns not to fear this anger or suppress it, but to let it move through them, to let it clarify their boundaries, to let it inform their decisions, to let it burn away what no longer serves them so something new can grow in its place. Because that's what this whole process is, a controlled burn, a necessary destruction of old patterns to make room for new growth. The empath is not breaking down. They're breaking through. They're not losing themselves. They're finding themselves. They're not becoming cold or hard or closed off. They're becoming honest and boundaried and whole. And in this wholeness, they discover capacities they didn't know they had, strength they didn't know they possessed, joy they didn't think was available to them. They discover they can be soft and strong simultaneously, that they can be compassionate and boundaried, that they can be open-hearted and discerning, that these aren't contradictions, they're integrations. The empath learns that true power isn't in how much you can endure, it's in knowing when to walk away. True strength isn't in how much you can carry, it's in knowing when to put something down. True love isn't in how much you can sacrifice, it's in showing up as your full self and inviting others to do the same. They also learn something about forgiveness, not the cheap kind that demands they forget what happened or pretend it didn't hurt, but the kind that allows them to release the weight of carrying other people's debts. They can forgive people for not being what they needed them to be without inviting those people back into their inner circle. They can let go of resentment without letting go of the lesson. They can release the past without repeating it. This discernment, this ability to hold complexity, is one of the gifts that emerges from the empath's awakening. They no longer see relationships in black and white. They don't need people to be all good or all bad. They can acknowledge that someone hurt them and still have compassion for that person's journey. They can recognize that a relationship served a purpose in their life, even if it's no longer healthy to maintain it. They can hold gratitude and goodbye in the same hand, and they realize that this nuanced, complex, sometimes messy way of moving through the world is actually more authentic than the simplified version they used to perform. The version where they were always fine, always available, always understanding. That version was a lie. A beautiful lie, perhaps. A well-intentioned lie. But a lie nonetheless. The truth is messier. The truth is that the empath has needs, gets tired, feels hurt, has limits, makes mistakes, isn't always emotionally available, can't fix everyone, shouldn't have to try. And that's okay. That's human. That's real. And in embracing this truth, this full, complicated, imperfect truth, The empath finally gives themselves permission to be human, not a saint, not a martyr, not an emotional support system with legs, just a person who cares deeply, feels intensely, and loves wholly, but also a person who deserves to receive as much as they give, who deserves rest as much as they deserve purpose, who deserves to be known as much as they know others. In the end, the empath learns that their greatest act of love isn't endless giving, it's living truthfully. Because when you live as your authentic self, boundaried and whole, you give others permission to do the same. You show them that it's possible to be sensitive in a harsh world without sacrificing yourself on the altar of everyone else's needs. That it's possible to care deeply without drowning in other people's pain. That it's possible to love fully while still maintaining the borders of your own soul. And maybe that's the real gift the empath offers the world, not the ability to absorb everyone's suffering, not the willingness to shrink so others can expand, but the courage to live as proof that empathy and self-respect can coexist, that kindness and boundaries can dance together, that you can feel everything and still honor yourself. This is the truth that emerges when the empath stops people-pleasing, that their sensitivity was never the problem. The world's demands on that sensitivity were, and they don't have to meet those demands anymore. They can walk away from relationships that require their erasure. They can refuse to participate in dynamics that drain their soul. They can build a life where their empathy is treasured, not exploited, where their presence is honored, not assumed, where their voice matters as much as anyone else's. And in that life, finally, the empath can rest. Not because the world has become easier or people have become kinder, but because they've learned the most radical lesson of all, that they deserve their own empathy too, that they are worthy of the same care they've given so freely to others, that their needs matter, that their boundaries are sacred, that their life is theirs to live, not theirs to give away piece by piece until nothing remains. This is what happens when the empath wakes up, when they stop performing and start being, when they trade the exhaustion of people-pleasing for the exhilaration of self-honoring. They don't lose themselves in the process. They find themselves, and what they find is stronger, clearer, and more beautiful than anything they ever pretended to be. In the end, the story of the empath who stops people-pleasing is not a story of becoming less sensitive or less caring. It's not about building walls or closing off your heart. It's not about becoming selfish or abandoning everyone who needs you. Those are the fears that keep empaths trapped in their old patterns, the belief that the only alternative to total self-sacrifice is total self-absorption. But there's a third way, a middle path, a place where empathy and self-respect coexist, where compassion and boundaries dance together, where you can feel deeply without drowning, where you can love fully without losing yourself. This path requires something that doesn't come naturally to the empath. It requires them to be as generous with themselves as they've always been with others, to extend to themselves the same patience they give to everyone else, to offer themselves the same forgiveness they so readily provide to those who've wronged them, to speak to themselves with the same gentleness they use with the people they care about. For many empaths, this is the hardest part, because somewhere along the way, they learn to treat themselves as the exception. Everyone else deserves kindness, but they deserve criticism. Everyone else's needs are valid, but theirs are optional. Everyone else gets second chances, but they must be perfect the first time. Breaking this pattern means confronting the internal critic that's been running the show for years. The voice that says, they're not doing enough, being enough, giving enough. The voice that turns every boundary into evidence of selfishness. The voice that interprets rest as laziness and self-care as indulgence. This voice is often old, older than the empath realizes. It might sound like a parent who praised sacrifice above all else. Like a teacher who rewarded compliance and punished assertiveness. Like a culture that conflates femininity with endless giving or masculinity with suppressing needs. Like a religion that preached martyrdom as the highest virtue. Whatever its origin, this voice has to be questioned, challenged, eventually replaced. Not with another extreme, not with a voice that says only your needs matter, take everything, give nothing. But with a voice that recognizes your needs matter as much as anyone else's. That reciprocity is not transactional, it's foundational. that you can care about others and care about yourself, that these aren't mutually exclusive options. The awakened empath develops a new internal dialogue, one that sounds more like a wise friend than a harsh judge. One that asks, "What do you need right now?" Instead of, "What should you be doing for everyone else?" One that says, "This relationship doesn't feel good to you," instead of, "You're not trying hard enough." One that recognizes, "You've given this person many chances," instead of, "Maybe if you just understand them better." This new voice becomes their compass, their guide, their anchor in moments when old patterns try to reassert themselves, because those moments will come. The empath will face situations where the old conditioning whispers that saying no makes them a bad person, that setting a boundary makes them difficult, that prioritizing themselves makes them selfish, and in those moments they have to choose. They have to decide if they're going to believe the old story or write a new one, if they're going to honor their growth or revert to their conditioning, if they're going to trust themselves or override themselves to keep the peace. Each time they choose themselves, not in defiance of others but in alignment with their own truth, they strengthen new neural pathways. They reinforce the belief that they matter. They prove to themselves that the world doesn't collapse when they honor their needs. They discover that healthy relationships not only survive boundaries, they thrive because of them. And gradually, over time, the choosing becomes easier. The boundaries become clearer. The guilt becomes quieter. The confidence becomes stronger. Not because the empath has become someone different, but because they've finally become who they always were beneath the performance. They remember things about themselves they'd forgotten, that they have preferences, that they have opinions, that they have dreams that don't revolve around facilitating everyone else's, that they have a personality beyond agreeable and available, that they have gifts beyond emotional labor. They rediscover interests they abandoned because they didn't have the energy for them. Hobbies that fell away when everything became about everyone else. Parts of themselves that went dormant because there was no space for them to exist alongside the constant caretaking. And as these parts reawaken, the empath realizes how much they'd shrunk, how small they'd made themselves, how much of their own light they'd dimmed so others wouldn't feel overshadowed, how many of their own dreams they'd deferred so others could pursue theirs. This realization isn't just sad, it's galvanizing, because now they can see what they've lost. And more importantly, they can see what's possible when they stop losing themselves, when they reclaim their energy, when they redirect their attention to their own life instead of living vicariously through everyone else's. The empath begins to build a life that actually excites them, not because it's impressive to others, not because it serves a particular role, but because it genuinely reflects who they are and what they value. They pursue things for the simple reason that those things bring them joy. They make choices based on their own desires, not other people's expectations. They create space for the person they're becoming, not the person everyone got comfortable with them being. And yes, this creates discomfort for some people. The people who benefited from the old version don't always appreciate the new one. They might accuse the empath of changing, of becoming difficult, of not being the person they used to know, and they're right. The empath has changed, is changing, will continue to change. Because growth is change, evolution is change, healing is change. The question isn't whether the empath has changed, it's whether the people around them can adapt to that change, whether they can appreciate the fuller, more authentic version of the person they claim to care about, whether they can celebrate the empath's liberation or only mourn their own loss of convenience. True friends, true family, true partners, they adjust. They might need time to understand. They might have their own discomfort to process. But ultimately, they choose the relationship over the comfort. They choose the person over the performance. They choose growth over stagnation. And the empath learns to cherish these people, to invest in these relationships, to show up for them not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire. Because these are the relationships built on solid ground. These are the connections that honor both people's humanity. These are the bonds that make life richer instead of just harder. In time, the empath's life looks different, quieter perhaps, smaller maybe, but deeper, more meaningful, more authentic. They have fewer relationships but better ones, less drama but more peace, fewer demands but more reciprocity, less performing but more presence. They discover that quality matters more than quantity, that 3 genuine friends are worth more than 30 acquaintances who only call when they need something, that 1 reciprocal relationship is more nourishing than 10 one-sided ones, that being truly known by a few people is more fulfilling than being superficially admired by many. And they realized this is what they were searching for all along. Not the approval of everyone, not the title of most helpful, most understanding, most available, but the experience of being seen, truly seen, for who they are, not what they provide, for their whole self, not just their useful parts, for their authentic presence, not their carefully crafted performance. This is the gift on the other side of people-pleasing. Connection that doesn't cost your soul. Love that doesn't require your disappearance. Belonging that doesn't demand your conformity. Acceptance that embraces your boundaries. Relationships where you can be imperfect, unavailable, complex, human, and still be valued. The empath who reaches this place often looks back with amazement at how far they've come, at how much they tolerated, at how little they asked for, at how ready they were to accept crumbs and call it a feast, at how they convinced themselves that exhaustion was virtue and self-abandonment was love. They feel compassion for who they were, understanding for why they made those choices, gratitude that they finally found the courage to make different ones, and determination to never go back, to never again betray themselves in the name of keeping others comfortable, to never again shrink so someone else can stay small. This is the legacy of the awakened empath. Not bitterness or cynicism or a closed heart, but wisdom, discernment, maturity, the integration of their sensitivity with their strength, the marriage of their compassion with their boundaries, the union of their ability to feel deeply with their commitment to honor themselves. They become a beacon for other empaths who are still trapped in the cycle, living proof that you can break free, that you can change the pattern, that you can honor your gifts without sacrificing yourself, that you can be sensitive in a harsh world and still maintain your sovereignty. And perhaps this is the highest expression of the empath's gift, not in absorbing everyone's pain, not in fixing what isn't theirs to fix, not in carrying burdens that belong to others, but in demonstrating through their own life that another way is possible, that empathy and self-respect can coexist, that you can care deeply without drowning, that you can love fully without losing yourself. This is what happens when the empath stops people-pleasing and starts seeing the truth. They don't just save themselves, they light the way for others to do the same.